Good afternoon. Welcome to this week's AI Would Agree. Welcome to the show. If you've joined us before, good to see you all back. Give me a couple of seconds while the streaming platform catches up. Here we go. It did this last week as well. I'm going to have to turn this new feature off. And I'm back. Still doing it. Great fun. And here we are. I'm back. Don't panic. Second week in a row. I'm going to have words with StreamYard. What's going on? Apologies for the technical difficulties. We'll start again. Welcome to the show. 1st of December already. Really, where has 2022 gone? And we are now edging on towards 50 episodes of AI Would Agree. So everybody who's been an audience member, everybody who's been a guest, thank you very much for your support so far. And long may it continue, because there's no plans to stop anytime soon. So watch this space. And this week's guest is Chris Warburton. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, Paul. Nice to see you. How are things?
I'll be a lot better if technology played ball with me on a weekly basis. It would be nice.
It only goes wrong whenever you go live. That's the problem.
That's the kicker.
Same with
right?
demos. Yeah. The same with demos as well. It's live demos.
Yeah, you get in nice and early, 10 minutes to check everything's working. Brilliant. Everything's hunky dory. Click the go live button. Everything falls over. It's all good. It's all good. We're still here. Awesome. So, Chris, me and you've been talking, probably about the best part of 2 years now, right? It's been a moment. For the benefits of anybody who's watching, so I guess if you're not involved in the collection space, they may not know who you are, which I find quite surprising and worrying. But would you like to just kind of give a brief background of how you got where you are and how you got involved in contact center world in the first place?
Yeah. So I suppose my background originally was, I got a science background originally, but way back I joined American Express. So I'm an American Express alumni from way back. And really, I started looking at finance, but sort of got into basically credit risk, and then started looking at the performance of basically the collections departments or even the origination departments within credit cards. And then that got me into operations. I went out to Canada, then I came back and did some stuff back in the UK for some banks, and I've done consulting, really, I suppose, in the collection space. So it's been either large leadership of operations teams, or more sort of like advisory type work, looking around, collections processes and technology and those kind of things. And some of the stuff I've been doing now with the RO strategy piece is, we've been chatting because we did some stuff around what is some of the collections technology and how does that kind of link through, and because it's such a dynamic kind of market at the moment with the cost of entry has sort of gone down, and it's so much easier to get new ideas into the space, get them set up and running, and then really sort of changing some of the processes. And it's been just a terrific sort of time of change, really. So that's kind of what I've been doing now, really.
Awesome. Yeah, and there's been a lot of change across the industry over the last year or so. Obviously, we've seen consumer duty come in and lots of different bits and pieces. Now starting to make changes in the industry. I think you were part of a collections panel not so long back, right?
No, I've been lots of panels. The state of the collections market at the moment, is that there's been a huge amount of change, I suppose, over the last sort of 10, 15 years. With the FCA getting set up and this wider focus, I suppose, on treating customers fairly and a different kind of approach to collections. Consumer duty is almost like the latest iteration of that, which is, looking around good outcomes, and it's sort of the bar keeps getting raised from a regulatory point of view. So that regulatory change has been going on. We've had technology change that sort of, with processing powers and some of the the new sort of innovations that come through that help us deal with some of that. We've got and then the latest thing that's really going through outside of consumer duty is just like economic changes that are looking at. And we thought that was going to happen at the start of the pandemic, but now it looks like we've got inflation's running pretty high or very high. We've got energy costs that are coming through. Interest rates that are going up, and all of that's putting pressure onto consumers, which again will flow through into the collections process. So there's a lot of change that's going on at the moment. Really, it's been a busy time.
So what's some of the trends that you're seeing for businesses that are in that collection space right now? Because I guess there's a big dilemma right now in terms of, you can push people too hard to collect the money's owed and end up making things a lot worse for yourself than what it would have been. So what's the general feel?
It's kind of interesting at the moment, because sort of going into the pandemic, everyone thought the world was going to fall apart. So we were all locked down. Everyone in the contact center space, they were super busy trying to set up virtual teams, put in digital processes, those kind of things. But from an arrears point of view, and people actually not paying their bills, it really wasn't as bad as anyone thought it was. And in fact, what actually happened was a lot of people, they were furloughed or they were staying at home. They didn't have to commute. They actually ended up paying off loans and saving money rather than actually sort of going further into debt. And people's behaviors kind of changed. So although we thought the world was going to end, it kind of didn't to a certain extent, and we ended up sort of surviving through it. We're sort of going to this almost like next period again, and we haven't really seen the impact yet. And so if you talk around, obviously energy costs have gone up, interest rates have gone up, inflation's there. We can all see it when we go shopping, when we go to the supermarket. It costs more money than it did before, but it hasn't actually hit. You talk to most people, it hasn't hit in terms of like more people going into collections, particularly on a larger scale that you might expect. Which is kind of interesting. Everyone's expecting it to happen probably in the new year now, but it's not really sort of impacting sort of volumes now. But we obviously hear it in the media around sort of increased stress on people. Where I do think you see more of the volume is probably in the customer care area. So you see it more upstream, if anything. So it's almost like we're in that sort of, people have got savings, they've paid down their loans, but now they're getting to more financial stress. So I'm going to call into my water utility, I'm going to call into my energy utility and say, well, what do I do before I know I'm going to have a problem in the future? What do I do now before I have a problem? So that's it's sort of causing a lot of sort of volume upstream, but it isn't necessarily sort of translating into the arrears process. When I was at a panel the other day, and I think the concern was that all of this pressure is building up, and at some point it's going to crack, and then it's going to basically flood out. And will that happen all at once? And that sort of, so we're pretty busy at the moment getting ready for that in terms of like, how do you handle a massive increase in volume? How do you sort of make sure that customers get in the right treatment, etc. Sort of, behind the scenes. But it's kind of a strange calm before the storm kind of feeling, I think, at the moment in the industry, I think. Although everyone's pretty busy, just trying to make sure they're ready, really.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the signs I see as a consumer is kind of people putting their Christmas lights up, and there's a lot of people actually this year that haven't put the Christmas lights up, or at least if they are, they're internal only. Whereas the last couple of years, everybody was going gung ho, like let's do Christmas properly because COVID's happened and we can't get out, we can't enjoy the things we normally would. So I'm going to go. They
do the whole house with Santa on the roof and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, guilty. Yeah.
But I haven't done it yet. I want to do it. I haven't done it yet.
It's interesting to see like those, like there's still houses that are doing that. So I guess from if I'm going to extrapolate on that, there are like people out there that are very much aware of what's about to happen, and they're being quite sensible about things and trying to preempt as much as they can. There are other people out there that are aware it's going to happen, but they're still just kind of going full tilt into it, and we'll see whether it's as bad as what everybody's estimating it's going to be, I guess.
And that kind of happened in the pandemic, and it's one of the things that makes it very difficult is we know the way we used to react to things, but one of the things that's very hard to take into account is, well, how will the consumers react to a new situation? So the fact that we've got this, are consumers going to change their behavior as a result of the situation that sits in front of them, and will that change the dynamics that happened? I mean we're probably all sitting in here where it's our houses are 2 degrees colder than it was last year. I mean, mine is. And I take my gloves off to be on the calls, but it's true. I mean, my house is colder than it was, a couple of years ago, but that just so we can save a bit of money on energy, right? So, we're changing our behaviors as a society, and then that changes the dynamics of what happens in the collections process, or the arrears process, or even the customer care process, because it's just a different dynamic, because as human beings, we adjust to it. Of
I
which
think that's
Christmas lights is an example, right?
yeah, that's fair, and I think it leads back into what you were saying about those upstream issues in terms of customer service. For me, it's important for businesses right now to be understanding exactly what's being talked about in those conversations, to be kind of pulling out their own data and insights from what the customers are seeing, so they can get ahead of. Can you extrapolate who's likely to end up in a collections route and try and preempt that a little bit? Be proactive about things rather than just letting it happen. Is that something you're seeing in the industry?
I absolutely agree. I mean, so we've been chatting about that in terms of because by the time a customer's got to the arrears process, I mean, they're already falling behind, right? So you're on the back foot there trying to make it up. I mean, it's much better to try and get to the situation earlier if you can. So before they go into collections, how do you build that engagement now? And now's the time to do it. Build the engagement now, understand, maybe they might be going to have an issue, maybe not, but you've got that awareness around where they can go to get help before they need it. So it almost like preempts it. And I think that's so important. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it's all around, like, how do you build engagement? How do you build regular engagement? How do you sort of get people involved in your brand, involved in the process, and then put in support mechanisms or highlight support mechanisms. So if they do need it, and hopefully they don't, but if they do need it, it's not a big surprise. They know where to go. They're not in a panic. It just becomes a much easier process for them. And I think that's kind of a premium now, more than almost like any other time, to basically do that. Customers give away so much information upstream, right, as well. You can find out. I mean, I always talk about, like the voice call as an example. I mean, human beings, we're almost like information gathering machines, aren't we? I mean, sort of, you can see, the halo around my head. You can see my background. You learn more about me interacting with me than you do just if I'm just a number on a spreadsheet. So it's almost like, how do you gather that information? How do you gather the information from the conversation, or from the interaction that could be useful downstream? I mean, to really help people out and get better outcomes for people.
Yeah, I think for me, it's important that you kind of work backwards from the desired outcome. And I think that's the bit that most businesses miss, is they wish they had the desired outcome, but they never really tried to work backwards from it to figure out what they'd need to collect downstream, or what's possible to collect upstream to make that happen. Or if they do collect that information, then they miss the key point of taking actions on it, because they've collected the information. It's like, well, pat on the back, brilliant, we've found all this information, that's what we needed to know. But then there's usually an element missing in terms of doing something with it, because maybe there's a cost element attached to that, or whatever, and there's a short-sightedness sometimes between, do we sign off this bit of budget now to preempt this, and maybe do some outbound conversations or whatever's necessary based on the information we have, or do we just suck it up and know that this person's going to end up down this route at some point?
Yeah, I mean, the information piece is kind of interesting, because you don't actually know the information that might be useful downstream as well, and you almost got to get into almost like this iterative kind of process to say, well, look, these people have had these problems. How do you look through that and almost like go back from that outcome, albeit that it's an example, going back upstream and doing almost like that's that outcome testing to say, well, look, this is the situation upstream, to say, well, look, and what other people are in that same situation that we can learn from this person who's been in this situation over here. We can learn from that to maybe help them to avoid it. I mean, it's that iterative loop that becomes difficult, and it becomes particularly difficult when it's across different departments often as well, doesn't it? So it's like how do you sort of do it so it becomes a customer view rather than departmental view, or departmental meeting your year-end goals sort of thing. So that's a challenge. But I mean, upstream and connecting collections to upstream is always something that we would talk about. But I do think it's ever more important now than it probably ever has been, in many ways, probably in most of my career in many ways. So it's important. And it's not just a UK issue, right? And it's everywhere as well. So you talk to people in other markets, and it's the same inflation. We're all so connected these days. It's very much a similar situation we're all in. So it's going to be interesting to see how it sort of plays out. I think in the next, probably into the new year. I think.
And I think it's probably tied quite closely with actually that there's quite a lot of focus right now on reducing overheads and shrinking business spend at the same time. So it's kind of like that double-edged sword as to you probably need to spend some money to solve this problem, but actually most businesses don't have that money there. So how do you do more with less? And almost going back to that kind of Boy Scout attitude of like, let's just go back to basics and think outside the box in terms of what we can do. Combined with like what I think now is a much more magnified view from your point from like the FCA in terms of better understanding how businesses are treating customers in general. Like how do you make sure that you're prepared for the expectations of both the industry watchdog and what the customers expect of you at the same time, whilst not having much budget to do it. It's a tight position to be in for most businesses, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's always the challenge, isn't it? Which is, how do you do more with less? I think, as much as there being cost cutting, I think it's the more I'm more worried about the volume increase, right? So it's rather than doing more with less, it's like you're going to have to do more with the same, in some ways. It's like, and how do you invest? Because one of the other challenges out there is just recruitment, right? So a lot of firms have been having issues with recruitment. Inflation doesn't help because there's wage inflation that goes on, and there's a lot of open positions at the moment. But that's with our existing volume. What happens if volume doubles? I mean, where are the people going to come from to process it? If you just scale up your existing processes, you're going to need double people for double volume. So it's like you've got to find the economies of scale, and how do you sort of like leverage that? And digital's one way of doing it. Can you look at your processes differently? Can you find economies of scale, find different ways of doing it, use digital for part of it rather than, or an increasing part of it, so you get the economies of scale of that, and just use the people to have, maybe the more human-centric kind of conversations that are important, right? So it's like, how do you sort of find that balance, really?
It was an interesting comment made by Clinton Cohen, who was our guest last week, was around actually what he's starting to see, I guess especially in this space where they've got a history in it, is the agents are more or less becoming the SME for the customers. So the digital is kind of automating the less skilled, more mundane stuff, which is leaving the agents free to be the experts that the customers need them to be. And I thought that was quite a nice way of summing up where I'm sure most businesses want to be there, but to your point, it's really quite tight with that gap in talent that we've got at the moment, in terms of probably people are doing other jobs that appeal to them a little bit more. Maybe they're just a change from what they've done in the past. It's certainly quite hard to attract the right people, and certainly experts in what you're trying to do.
I mean, and it's so much more interesting if you're in a contact center. It's so much more interesting to do those more interesting sort of human interaction type pieces than just doing sort of like this just the sheer processing piece that can be done more automatically. And I think the pandemic taught us, or trained all of us. I mean, I don't mean sort of all of us as customers, how to do things much more sort of automatically or digitally. But there is still that need, right? To sometimes you just need to talk with someone. And I had a boss who would always explain about the experience you used to get at the airline check-in, where you'd sort of like you go to the airline check-in, you say, well, I need to change my seat, and they'll be sort of there at the they'll be there at the console, and they're tapping away, and they keep on tapping, and they keep on tapping, and they keep on tapping, and then you get a new ticket. But then you go to the console where it's been redesigned and it's being done digitally, and you just press from one seat to the other seat, and the whole thing just happens just like that. And it's like, how do we think about our processes differently? How do we redesign our processes to make it much slicker? Because that airline agent should just have the same sort of interface, where they just change you from one seat to the other, and then they spend the rest of the time talking to you, asking you about how your holiday is, or they do special treatment and making you feel great about the brand. And it was just we just got to start thinking about it in those kind of ways, I think.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, though, what you've also got to be cautious of is that we often talk about customer vulnerability, and one of my big focuses is around agent well-being and agent vulnerability as well. Like, if you're encouraging your agents to have much more in-depth, much more emotive conversations and empathetic conversations, they're also going to need much more emotional support as a result of it, because they're no longer dealing with transactional inquiries where it's just kind of move house, yes, okay, job done, update your mailing preferences, move on. Actually, now you're having in-depth conversations about sometimes very sad conversations or very emotive conversations from a customer's perspective. Your agents are going to need much more support. And if you want to retain those experts that you've got, then you need to be doing something that actually changes the narrative that we've seen so far for a lot of the industry. And I don't think that's true of collections. I think collections have always kind of understood that to an extent. But when you combine that with hybrid working, remote working, it becomes very hard to do a really good job of that in the way that we used to.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you're having vulnerable customer conversations, customers who are in extreme financial difficulty, I mean, they're very hard calls, right? And it takes a toll. It's a tough job, right? And it is a tough job, and they need to be given the support they need to. The other thing that comes through is just in terms of some of the targets that come through. So it doesn't mean to say that you're being driven by shorter call times, as an example, is always a measure that used to be looked at, but really, if you're dealing with much more complex cases, then those dynamics will change. So you might have more calls overall, but your call lengths might be increasing for those that are done through an agent, because those are the more complex ones. So we need to understand all of those moving parts. How does it all move together to make sure that it's being efficient, but also being effective as well? I mean, it's just making sure you really understand the dynamics of how it's changing.
And I think it's crucial to kind of be monitoring the complexity of those conversations. You're absolutely right. I think that's really hard to do well. It's something that, obviously our technology can do relatively easily, and it's something that I'm super proud of, because of the way it can impact on exactly that, those metrics that you're talking about. We should, great. Every business needs to have as low an AHT as possible, an average call time or whatever. But actually, when you look at the agents that aren't hitting that average handling time target, what's the reason for them not hitting it? And then when you see that actually they're getting, much more complex calls, then go into the level of understanding why are those agents consistently getting much more complex calls, because they're still getting the random pot that everybody else gets. It could be time of day, it could be time of week that they work, but it also is probably more likely to be the fact that they're actually just asking the right questions. And I think that's crucial for businesses to understand is, are your agents getting to the root of the problems, or are you just kind of forcing them along a route where they end up just trying to deal with that transaction and no more? Because I think those days have got to be past us now.
I mean, it's difficult because you tend to look at things almost like at an average level, at a KPI level. But I mean, understanding things like mix issues, as you talk about, I mean, there could be mix issues, there could be competence issues in terms of are they actually doing a better job or not, or in terms of how it's actually being carried out. But getting into that level of detail to really understand it is really what you've got to try. I mean, the management team have really got to do to really understand, to make sure that that it is being efficient. I mean, you want it to be efficient, but also that there's the opportunities being made as well, or is being taken. Because it is important. It's very easy to make snap decisions, isn't it? Just based off key KPIs, and you don't understand, almost like trying not to draw a graph, but you have the distribution right, and what does the distribution mean, and understanding the distribution, and then almost like segments within that. So really understanding what the performance, and is it reasonable or not, right? So one way or the other. It takes a bit of time, but there's so many mix issues coming up. Back to the top of the call, is we've got to understand it now. What is driving it, because you don't want to have an average service for everyone, because that means that some of the people aren't getting what they need. You really want to have the best service you can that's sort of tailored to all of the customers.
I think the other lesson to learn for businesses is, obviously I came from a discount retail background. And if I look back at how that business, I mean, I was there for the credit crunch. So I joined in 2004, 2005, and I saw the impact that the 2008 recession had on that business. And what's become clear to me time and time again is that the businesses that do right by their customers and do right by their teams now, regardless of the cost to their bottom line, providing they can survive that, they're the businesses that will come out of this, out of the starting blocks, and be leaps and bounds ahead of their competition, because those businesses that are brave enough to do the right thing now, regardless of the cost, regardless of the ear chewing from the boardroom or the shareholders or whatever, you're doing the right thing now, then that's that. I mean, it's like when we talked about compliance the other week, right? It's doing the right thing even when nobody's looking. Now is the time to double down on what you do best and accelerate what you're doing.
And I suppose you can't really underestimate the value of brand loyalty, right? So it's the fact that if you're doing the right thing, I mean, this is the experience between it's almost like the old world of collections and the new world of collections. I chatted about this earlier in the week. Is in the old world of collections, it was really around like how can I collect the money, and now it's really based on how do you get good outcomes. And you would have thought, I mean, I sort of went away and came back from the UK, and you would have thought moving from collecting the money to getting good outcomes, that it would have really impacted the bottom line in terms of like pounds collected, or in terms of, but really it doesn't, because actually by giving good customer outcomes, by actually talking with people respectfully, making sure that you're offering the support they need, you actually move further up the payment hierarchy. So you actually customers are more likely to pay you as a result of you treating them fairly or treating them well. So it's a bit of a leap of faith for people, but the industry's largely gone down that road, and it's been very beneficial. And I tell you what, for the contact center agents, those people who are having the calls, it's so much more rewarding than it used to be. I mean, they're much more. It's much more fulfilling to have a call where you're helping customers out, you're really offering the support, and you're actually helping them out of a tricky situation, than it is just trying to get them to pay 1 month past due, or just trying to pay them when they're just like casually in arrears. I mean, it's a night and day different conversation. It's so much more rewarding for folks, but albeit but you still get the tough calls, right? So, but it's not an easy job, but it can be rewarding.
Yeah, sure. Do you think that some of that decision making boils down to the shortening tenure of senior leadership and kind of wanting to make an impact quickly as opposed to thinking about the long term?
I don't think so. Well, I don't think so now, because I think the regulators they've sort of guarded against some of that stuff. I mean, I think back in the 80s and the 90s, you could probably leverage some of that criticism in terms of us being quite short term. I think that's largely they've tried to moderate that even through regulation. There is still a little bit of that out there, but I mean that's probably true. That's true. It's not a collections issue. That's probably a societal issue, isn't it? In terms of we're all quite short term, right? Rather than looking long term. I think when you look at a credit crunch coming through, or a cost of living crisis coming through, you're going to have to take long term views on customers, aren't you? Rather than short term, just like you were saying back in 2008. So it can seem a little bit alien, but it's probably the right thing to do. I mean, and sectors in collections world do it. I mean, so for example, a lot of the way the debt collection agencies or the debt purchase world can work in terms of taking a much longer term view around, basically being patient for the situation to change.
Yeah.
So it's not alien, completely alien, but society we've been quite focused on, how do I get something instantly rather than sort of waiting 6 months down the road.
Awesome. I guess just before we wrap up the show quickly, Chris, like obviously you've mentioned ROER. You'd like to kind of explain to the viewers who's watching, you've not maybe seen your podcasts and your website, just a little bit about what it is that you do in terms of the vlogging side of your business. Be interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that kind of started really as working in an operation. You sort of like you tend to spend a lot of your time sort of talking with your team, talking with the same people, rather than sort of being able to get out into the wider industry and and see really what's out there. And there's so much change going on, and I saw that sort of crossing over into the more of the advisory space in terms of just how much innovation is really going on. So really what the videos are really just trying to spend time really understanding what are some of the new innovative techniques that are out there, some of the new technologies that are out there, some of the new ideas that are being talked about. of which, voice analytics. We talk about different types of messaging. We'll talk about all sorts of different things. So whatever's new is trying to bring that out in a digestible form to the audience, really, which is people in collections and people in credit risk, or anyone who's interested, you can have a look. So it's really trying to provide that digest in an easy to sort of consume form. Really, so people can stay up to date and access some of the new ideas. So it's been a load of fun doing it. So these podcasts are a load of fun. So
important thing.
I've met some really interesting people and some great ideas out there as well.
That's absolutely the most important thing, I have to say, Chris. So yeah, well done for keeping up as long as you have, because you've probably been running that series longer than I've been running I would agree, which is good. Makes me feel as though I've still got some ways to go. But yeah, by all means, and Chris, and after the show, feel free to kind of pop the link for your website onto the comments of this video, and I'll make sure it gets through to everyone. Chris, you've been a great guest on the show, and I think it's a topic that's really pertinent and at the top of people's minds just now. So hopefully everybody's kind of took something away from it. But anybody who's watching the show, if you'd like to chat with Chris a bit more in detail, if you'd like to reach out to either of us, feel free. We're both open to kind of networking on LinkedIn, and we'll have conversations with people. Or if you'd like to ask the question in the comments on LinkedIn or YouTube or wherever you're viewing, more than happy to respond there as well. Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks very much, Paul. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad we got all our technical issues finally. Again, words will be had. All right, thanks very much. And if I don't see you before, Chris, how can I say this out loud on the 1st of December? Have a great Christmas, Chris.
Either we can say it now. It's December. We can actually start. So I've been waiting. I think I might have had one before in November, but it's only 3 weeks now. So it's getting close.
It is. And I think I've only got one more week of this show left as well. So I'm going to make the most of it.
I need to put my lights up. So.
Absolutely. Look, send me a photo. All right. Thanks everyone for coming along to the show, and I'll see you again next week. Interestingly, I haven't yet advertised who the show next week is going to be. You'll have to wait until tomorrow morning to find out. But suffice to say, I have said a very special guest for the last one of the year. I'm not telling you who. We'll find out tomorrow. Thanks. Bye-bye.